Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Educator Experience podcast. My name is Salli Carter, and fun fact about me, I spent about 15 years of my adult life living in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is where our guest today resides. So we had some interesting pre-conversation. I personally have really fond memories of getting up early before work, going for a run on the seawall, sipping on my green tea on my balcony, just people watching and looking at the ocean. It's just beautiful. If you haven't been to Vancouver, check it out. Put it on your list. It's breathtaking. Today's guest, Kevin Spenst, is an author, poet, and educator with over 30 years of experience teaching adults in classrooms, workshops, and through mentorships. Currently, he teaches at Alexander College and Simon Fraser University's The Writers Studio, where he's one of the poetry mentors. Kevin shares his journey from his childhood love of learning to becoming a published poet and educator. And I think it's really interesting in this conversation how he talks about growing up religious and reading the Bible contributed to his love of poetry. And as an ESL educator, he also touches on the impact of connecting with international students and truly celebrating and integrating their cultures into our classrooms, and how that sign of respect and connection can truly amplify the learning experience for everyone involved. Kevin has a book launch coming up this fall for his new book, Stanley Park Manor, A Collective History, which is a collection of essays and poems about his longtime residence in Vancouver's West End, about all the people who've passed through their stories and experiences, as well as his own. He mentions in our chat how he is really a place-based poet or person and how he feels connected to places. And I personally connect with that, as I often connect places I've been with feelings or emotions around those experiences. And as I mentioned just previously, my love of Vancouver and those place-based memories. So included a link to his upcoming book, which you can preview it, if that's even a term, before it launches this fall. So check it out. Let's get to it with my new friend from Vancouver, Kevin Spence.
Being an educator is one heck of a lonely journey, but every step holds a story, an experience that shapes how we teach, learn, and grow. Welcome to the Educator Experience. I'm your host, Salli Carter, and together we'll explore the moments that define us as educators. Through authentic conversations and shared experiences, we're building a community that connects, reflects, and inspires, all while breaking down barriers in education, one story at a time. You are not alone. Let's grow together.
I'm so excited to have you join us today. Thank you so much from rainy Vancouver, but your smiling face wouldn't be able to tell that it's raining and dreary out. So I'd love to get to know you a little bit, how you got into education, a little bit about you.
Well, thank you. Grew up thinking I would be a teacher. From a young age, I loved the classroom. I loved the environment. I loved the opportunity to learn. I went on to university, not knowing exactly what kind of education I'd get into, but I was doing well in the classroom in high school. So I just continued that into college and university. And then I met somebody at university who was starting at a school. He had an entrepreneurial mindset. He was studying philosophy, but he was interested in business. And so after he graduated with a bachelor's in philosophy, he actually started an ESL school. And he asked if I wanted to work at his school. And I had thought I would do elementary school education for a bit, but found that it wasn't quite the right fit. I started the PDP program at Simon Fraser University, but a couple of months in, I realized it wasn't quite the right direction for me. So I benefited tremendously from having met this fellow at SFU, and I started teaching at his school. And there was a Korean woman and a Japanese woman, I think, for the very first class. It was small,
You
but
just
at
said, oh, that's
school,
awesome. What a
that
nice
was it.
experience. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah. That's so ideal, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So it was great because I grew along with the class
Yes.
size, and I learned so much from the beginning about Korean culture, Japanese culture, and on it went. I worked at that school, at first school, for about a year, taught English in Taiwan for a year, which was another big learning curve in Taipei, and teaching all over the city. It was fantastic. And then I came back to Vancouver and then ended up teaching at other schools. I took a break to do an MFA in creative writing at UBC. And then after that, I ended up at ILSC, which was the first private ESL school in Vancouver to unionize and help other schools unionize. And so there were some nice perks. It's a great place. I met a lot of fantastic people. Went back to university again. I think every 10 years I seem to be going back to university. I
Loop.
got an MA. Yeah, yes, exactly. I got an MA in English literature, and then upon completion of that, was able to work at a small Vancouver college where I've been for four and a half years, Alexander College.
It's awesome. So what do you teach at Alexander College? Because I happen to know a little bit about your background, but are you still doing English second language?
No. So, but Alexander College was a good fit because it's a bit of an overlap between the academic and the international student body. So there are students from predominantly India, but then also Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and then also Latin America. And populations of students that I'm quite familiar with from my ESL background, but they all come into the classroom at a higher level of education for the most part. And I've been teaching poetry this past term, English 102 poetry, which is kind of a dream semester to end on because the international student numbers are declining so dramatically. For now, my work there is on pause, but it was a fantastic semester to end on, and bringing poetry into the classroom with students who have their own traditions of poetry and their own sensibilities, but a keenness for the most part was really a fantastic time. And then I also teach at Simon Fraser University's The Writers Studio, and that's where I have a group of 9 poets, and I work with them over the course of the year, and I work with them on their poetry and helping them get their poetry um, tighter, sharper, and more focused. And then by the end of the year, they have 20 poems, a little collection that they may send off
So
for
I've never
publication.
actually heard of this before. It's a non-credit course and they're doing it on their own time, or is it credited?
It's a non-credit course, so it exists under the continuing studies department, and it's all, I've been teaching that for a couple of years now, and I love it because we have people from all across North America. It's over Zoom, and I have people from their mid 20s to their 60s, so a wide age range, a big cast of characters from around North America.
Can imagine.
And I say characters because they're really fantastic people with really interesting life experiences who
Yeah.
want to write, and so it's always a really interesting dynamic. And there's an overlap, of course, in the Alexander College classroom, we're analyzing poems, but we're also considering what makes them work. And then at the writer's studio at SFU, we're also looking at them carefully and seeing what makes them work and what can make them work better.
This is so interesting. I don't have the pleasure of speaking with too many poets, so I'm just going to pick your brain. So where did your love of poetry stem from? Do you remember? Was there like an aha moment of this is what I want to write or what I'm most attracted to in English?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's an interesting question because I think over the course of my life, I would answer that differently,
Mm.
perhaps. And I would say there are a couple of different moments that point to this very moment in conversation with you now, one of which is growing up. very religious growing up, going to church, having the Bible, memorizing passages for Sunday school as a kid, being so intensely kind of focused on that. My background, my family background is Mennonite, so there was lots of kind of religions kind of baked into the cultural background of my family, and singing for big family get-togethers, hymns, and lots of ministers, missionaries, Bible translators. When I stopped believing as a teenager, I think that love of the word kind of just jumped to a little anthology of poetry that I picked up while in Ontario, visiting family. I got this little pocket collection, an anthology of English poetry or something. And I'd been, interested in the arts, broadly speaking, as a teenager, but it was getting that book at that time, especially, that kind of
Just
took
everything
me.
collided for you.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so reading E. E. Cummings for the first time, a poem that I had no comprehension of, it was so bizarre. What if a much of a witch of a wind gives the truth to summer's lie, bloodies with dizzying leaves the sun, and yanks immortal clouds awry? I read that and I was like, what does this mean? But I really think that took me back to, probably one of the first times I encountered the Bible, wondering, like, what does this mean? And it put me back in a place where I had to learn again.
This is so beautiful. Okay, makes sense to me. I teach, and I'm not sure if I should be teaching English classes, but sometimes I get hired for some super random things. Um,
Yeah.
and I've done some English 12 and lower university English classes. And my favorite, or the part of those classes that seem to connect the most with students, is when we do poetry time and allow for that creativity and learning of potentially a different space than they've heard of before, but they can connect it to their culture, or something. That it's just this time in a class that it's such a pleasure to see people connect with and open up a piece of themselves. And the most quiet of the students just come up with these just incredible pieces that are emotional and connective. And it's just incredible. It's incredible. I have no business teaching an English class, but I love it. I love it. I figure it out as I go. I do not know a lot about poetry, but I tend to dive into, if I'm working with an Indigenous cohort, then I'll look into Indigenous poetry. Or if there are different cultures that I'm working with, I'll try and find poetry that maybe connects with them or challenges them in certain ways. So it's not my expertise by any stretch of the imagination, but it's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful thing to, I wouldn't say teach, but facilitate and really see people open up to. Yeah.
Well, that's just it. I mean, from any sort of background, people can engage in a poem, and then that can really facilitate fantastic conversation, reflection, the
Right.
different layers of the poem, touching on perhaps spirituality, maybe politics, certainly something personal. And that, I think, that focus on something else is also something that's fantastic, because many people face to face might be like, I don't know, like there might be some awkwardness, shyness, whatever. But then looking at this other thing, which can be open in so many different directions, can be so magic. I had one student from India, and one of the classes was, what's a word in your language that you love, something that means something to you? Title your poem that word, and begin every stanza with that word's translation in English, and then write out kind of what that means to you. And actually, we used a poem by Dallas Hunt, which is called Kinanaskomitin, which is the Cree word for thanks. And in that poem, Dallas Hunt starts every stanza with thanks, which then clues the reader into what that means. So here's a poem that's facilitating learning in its structure and in the use of repetition. So we had that as a model to kind of open up. And quite often, while we were looking academically at other poems, I'd get students to write so they could be inside kind of what that kind of feels like. So this one student wrote Shand, which is Punjabi for moon. And then she wrote about the moon out her window, the moon, as this comfort, while there was some turbulence in her family and conflict and shouting outside her bedroom door. But the moon, was what brought her some solace. You can't go wrong by bringing the moon into a poem, right? It is one of the
You've
most
seen me
poetic.
write a poem, though. I'm pretty sure I could bungle it up, Kevin, but I see what you're saying. Those type of classes have such a different vibe to them. We invite students to connect to a deeper part of themselves. So I teach a lot of business classes, and they're just not the same as when I teach something in poetry or writing, where people can really express themselves in a way that works for them. I love it. I love it.
Going back to that poem example, and thinking about repetition, which is one of the key features of that poem that we looked at. I mean, repetition works in different ways. Repetition is an essential part of education, of learning for many, right? I mean, if somebody's learning another language, they have to repeat
Repeat,
certain new
repeat. Yes.
vocabulary terms to get it in. There's that, very conventional, traditional rote learning, which can be a bit of a drag, or there's the opportunity to make it more engaging, more creative. Shand, I only remember because at that moment with that student, I was like, oh, sure, like quiet, it's night, and shand, or shand, and the hand and the quiet kind of brought it together, which is a mnemonic, like what sounds familiar in something different, and helping students consider what they have to bring to learning, and what resources they have in order to remember some of the basics that they may need. um, Certainly is tremendously rewarding, and it's great to kind of be in that environment of a certain type of repetition, but making it fun, and looking at it carefully and considering the different aspects of that particular type of learning, rote, but a type of learning that actually is one of the key features of poetry as an art form, right? Um, I was sick a couple of weeks ago, and I was
We were
watching
sick
lots
at
of
the same
videos.
time. We
Yeah.
were sick. Like, let's
Swept
reschedule. You're
across,
like, yes, this works for me.
just swept across North America.
Right?
Yeah. Um, so being sick, I then kind of aspired to this definition of poetry. I wouldn't really try to define poetry, I think, outside of kind of being cooped up at home and in a bit of a foggy headspace. But I kind of thought, poetry is repetition's enchantment through surprising turns of language. That was kind of the definition. Repetition. There's repetition of phrases. And this goes back to the Christian Bible. The magic trick of the Old Testament is parallel structure, big lines that kind of repeat in structure. And that's something that makes it memorable, powerful. But not just, those bigger phrases, a small clause might be repeated, or certainly a word ending, which we know as rhyme, or consonants, the repetition of a consonant sound, or assonance, repetition of a vowel sound. So down to the tiniest little thing, and then even imagistically, certain images repeat. I have, actually, I have a poem here. A friend of mine, Raul Fernandez, he actually made this painting behind me, and this
In
is
the
a
back
little,
there.
yeah, a little
Yes.
corner of
Gorgeous.
something. And this is a little chapbook that he made, and this chapbook, well, it's mostly repeating, take out the garbage and look at the moon. Take out the garbage, look at the moon. And then there are all these little variations from that. Take out the garbage, look at the moon. Take out the garbage, look at the moon. That
So cool.
repetition is enchanting, I think. And it's also getting us to think of this beautiful
Interesting. I
thing.
love the way that you say that. So repetition is enchantment. Um, when I was looking at your website, I was actually looking at that word. Is you saying chap book or chat
Yeah.
book?
And can you explain what
Chapbook.
it is, please? It's so perfect that you brought this up because I'm like, what is this? Because you have a
Yeah,
number of chapbooks too, correct?
that's
Yes.
correct. So I have 4 full-length books of poetry with Anvil Press, but I've also published with lots of smaller micro presses across the country. And these smaller books are known as chap books,
HAP.
C-H-A-P.
Got it. Okay.
C-H-A-P.
Chapbooks.
Yeah, and it's an awkward word. It's a really awkward
Like,
word.
what is
It
this
comes out of
new word?
England.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I wonder if in England at some point they kind of pronounced it in a way that just made more sense. The theory is that in the 1700s there were young men on the street selling these political or religious tracts, these little cheap books. So chap books or young lads, chaps. So chap books. So either it's the seller or the thing sold that kind of lent its name to this thing that came out of the explosion of free speech and all these different kind of religions coming out of the Protestant Reformation, but also the affordability of paper. And so it was this popular sort of print vehicle for disseminating all sorts of things, nursery rhymes and just popular literature. And then again, as I said, political or religious matters. In the late 1800s, with the arts and letters movement, there was a return to an interest in traditional cultural forms and modes. And then the chapbook was kind of taken up again, but mostly, almost exclusively as something for poetry, with traditional printing presses. No longer being necessary, the tiny form of a poem or a couple of poems could be printed out by people who had this particular attention, interest in the feel of a book, the look of a book,
Mm,
particular interest. So chapbooks in Canada for poetry emerged in the 1920s, and as well as other parts of North America. And then I believe with the dissemination, the ubiquitousness of technology everywhere, people want something in hand that feels a little more tangible and real. And
yes.
so we've seen a lot of these small chapbook presses come and go, but there's, I would say, a revival of interest in this form, certainly in the last 20 years. And I've been lucky enough to, send these little chappies scripts or little
Yes.
manuscripts
Yes.
and have them published. And they're also great experiments. So I'm not, I'm principally a lyric poet, but I'm curious in all forms. So concrete poetry is more visual.
Yeah.
And I had a bunch of drawings that I did over top of this BP Nickel poem, which is a concrete poem called Blues. And it's just the word love written kind of in different forms. It kind of looks like a crossword. And I drew over top of that. And then I think the title was What Would BP Nickel Doodle? And I was just thinking of the playfulness of the
Yeah.
60s and that
Yes.
cultural revolution. And so I submitted that to Paul Zitz, a fantastic poet in Calgary, and he published that through his 100 Tets Press, which was very short-lived, but that was 2014, I think. And then from there onwards, I've just really enjoyed the idea of conceiving of one little something, sending it off.
Yes. Please
I
share.
have the benefit of all these books behind me, some of which
This
are
is
my own.
so perfect. Okay. I get to see one.
Yeah, so
Surrey.
this is
Surrey sonnet.
Surrey Sonnets, and these are sonnets, but written on beer coasters, or the idea is that they're perforated and you
Oh,
can tear something out, and it's a beer coaster or a sonnet on the back.
they're so cool. So it can be totally innovative in terms of how you want it to be physically. This is so cool. Okay, well, I'm learning new stuff today. Thanks, Kevin. Looking back on your career for teaching, is there anything that stands out as an impactful moment or something you could share with us?
It was when I was first teaching ESL, or maybe 3 years into teaching ESL, I bought this book, Eastern Standard Time, it was called, and it was about pop culture from Asia impacting North America. Um, and I bought that book on Granville Street at the Granville Street Book Company. And reading that book really opened up my teaching approach. I then learned a little bit about this, a little bit of that. I learned some Korean fables, and knowing a bit about the naughty frog story kind of gave me the opportunity to ask a student, oh, tell me about the frog, and um, tell me about the naughty frog. And more often than not, whatever their level, they would tell the story because they knew this, and
Right.
they knew that, and they could confidently share this story in front of others as well. I'm trying to remember ribbit in Korean, which is something I learned at the time.
So cute.
And that was something that also was something they were like, "What?" But that was something that, then got me kind of thinking, how can I bring in the smallest something to open somebody up in a big way? And I would say teaching that at a pretty wild private ESL school called the Language Repair Shop, where kind of, the innovation was
So
kind
cute.
of celebrated. It was a pretty wild and fun place, and they supported, efforts at teaching in kind of new ways was fantastic.
So, what I hear you saying is that you will try to connect with your students by learning or bringing in things from their culture to initiate conversation, or
Yeah.
is that fair?
Yeah, gagul gagul is ribbit in Korean.
Ooh, yeah.
Gagul gagul. So anyway, yes, sorry,
Love
just
this. Yes, yes.
but
So
yeah,
do you still do that like in your other classes? Is this something that you've continued on, and how has it worked for you?
yeah, I'm really interested in how other languages outside of English impact English or exist side by side with English or influence people. So, for the most part, there are lots of bilingual or multilingual people in Vancouver, and many of these people are also interested in poetry. So, in my TWS class, there are people who come from other, non-English speaking traditions. And I encourage them to bring whatever they feel is appropriate to that particular poem, which may or may not be English, and think about how that language, other than English, is a part of them as they are kind of presenting some aspect of themselves or even just some aspect of the world, in order to, not only celebrate the linguistic diversity that we have, but also as a kind of educational tool in itself. If we have one culture with one language, and if that's pushed forward as a kind of model, well, that pushes us towards fascism, essentially. And I really think that by reminding people of all the different wordings and all the different ways and bringing that into poems, we'll be seeing how poetry is this model for moving forward into a future of diversities and growing
Mhm.
diversity. Then, in synthesis and fusion as well, right? I mean, we're not all like in our various linguistic groups, kept separate. There's a spilling over. There's the change. There are many different Englishes around the world. And so, how do we accommodate that? How do we think about that together so we're not, again, just in our particular small groups, but reaching out to other groups? And so I really I'm very excited by that idea and the potential in not only poetry, but the literary arts to explore this overlap and to help others gain some insight into what it's like to, speak this language or that language.
Mhm.
Um, Sadiqa Demeyer is a wonderful Canadian author, poet, and essayist, and she has a book, Alphabet. I'm not sure the other pronunciation, the Dutch pronunciation, and she writes about growing up bilingual, but then also I think her dad or mom, I forgot, was from India. So lots of different things that are so beautifully put to the page in her memoir.
Mm.
and this has been happening for decades now in terms of literature. Uh, Sedhu Binning's What Nor No More is the title, and that title combines Punjabi and English, and that's a book
Oh,
from I think 1994. So, for decades now, this has been happening. Poetry is a pretty small little niche area, and so people may not be aware of all these different things,
yeah.
but I think it's really exciting to kind of exist in this place where, yeah, as I said, alternatives are being imagined.
Mhm. I think you touch on a really interesting point in that sometimes I feel like students don't understand or know that they can bring their culture into their writing and that they feel that they have to be doing it the Western way or the English way or whatever that is. And it's this really incredible thing to see once they know that they can bring their culture, their own lived experiences into their writing. And even from business classes and communication courses that I teach, one of the things that I try to initiate with my students is to write about things that are of interest or they're passionate about. So forget about this topic here for a sec. What are you passionate about? And then maybe how can we bridge it together so it's not this daunting task? And it's just, yeah, it really helps bridge that gap, doesn't it? When people can write about something that's meaningful to them or integrate it somehow. It really helps a lot. I'm remembering
Mhm.
this last class in communications, new media and communications, and the students were struggling with how to format their essays, how to start their essays. And I just asked them to really think about something that they're passionate about, whether it's from their culture, if communications is not their main class or main niche. Like I had a biology student, biology major who just happened to be taking this class for extra credit and she wanted to work on her writing skills. And so I'm like, okay, well, what about what you're already doing? How can you integrate that here to get things started? I'm like, oh, that's really neat. I'm like, yeah. We don't always have to reach for this far fetched fruit. What's low hanging? What will help break the ice for you to just get you writing? Yeah. Your own lived experiences. There's nothing better to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. Where are your students predominantly from? Are they local or
This so
international?
they range. So the lower level of university students are all over, really diverse from around the world. But then the one class that I was talking about, semi-diverse. The communications class was a third year, semi-diverse. I think they felt, yeah, like they're in a box that they have to do things the Western way. And I try to create a space for them for students to celebrate the culture, talk openly about their culture because it can then enhance the conversation in so many rich ways. And also for people who don't know about maybe Indian culture, it can spark something for them, a potential new experience or connection. So, yeah, I think diversity is to be celebrated in our classroom spaces, and especially in writing.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's where
Yeah.
I've personally been able to see most of it kind of come through. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining. And as we start to wind down the conversation, I'm going to pick your brain and ask you for a piece of advice that you might have for a new educator coming into your field. I'll be even more
Good.
specific.
Well, if it is poetry, I would recommend reading widely and deeply in order to be able to bring as much of the world of poetry, as much of its history as possible to the classroom. And that's for reading or that's for analyzing, studying academically or producing writing poetry. I'd recommend finding that poet you love dearly, whose words just speak to you. They come off the page and they kind of reach you in a really interesting way. Read their biography, find out about their life. And I'd recommend somebody from the past or outside of the country, somebody who comes from another tradition. And in looking at that poet, deeply, and then Also reading widely, reading anthologies. Best of Canadian Poetry is a really fantastic series to get a sampling of the country every year. So I think those two things will help, anybody interested in teaching poetry on either side of that create or receive divide more effectively. And in terms of teaching international populations, I think it's really helpful to learn hello in different languages. So you start every class with, you know, um, ni hao ma, or, ohayo gozaimasu if it's morning in Japanese, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's a really nice way just to be like, oh, here is my effort at reaching other people from other linguistic traditions. And it's fun. It can be fun too. It can set an inviting, open, fun tone of you, the instructor, making mistakes, which
I
might be
love that. Yes.
the best place to kind of begin.
That,
Like I'm gonna botch this, but I'm gonna do my best, and
yeah.
you can help me, and we'll improve together.
I love that. So what's next for you? I know that I was looking on your website and you've done a bunch of tours. What's next for you? Do you have anything that you're writing currently? Are you taking a break? What's next for Kevin Spenst?
Well, thank you for asking that because I'm very excited to share the news that I will have my first book of prose coming out this September with Anvil Press. And this book of prose is a collection of essays about the building where I live, where I'm speaking to you from, the
My
Stanley
gosh, this is
Cup
so
Manor.
cool. Are you
Yeah,
serious?
yeah,
They're
yeah,
all about your building.
yeah.
The
So
building with
200
the
names.
the dumpsters right outside your window, but also a gorgeous view of Stanley Park.
Yes, and
Yeah.
cherry blossoms around the corner, and
Oh,
an amazing front entryway that's
mm.
super grand. The building, 1931, Lightheart Brothers, they built a ton of buildings at the first, during the first couple of decades of the 20th century. This was their last big, grand kind of production. W.A. Lightheart specifically. Most of the brothers had worked together on other buildings, but this building came up 142 at the time, I believe, bachelor units. So lots of people in this smallish building, certainly small units, and then tons of history. Pierre Burton, living here in the 1940s. Seema Holt, also at that same time, another journalist, one of the first female reporters, kind of doing the crime beat in Vancouver at that time. And then more recently, Abbas Akavan, internationally renowned visual artist, who's representing Canada this year at the Venice Biennale. And, he was a previous tenant, and lots of actors and blah, blah, blah. So I have a number of accounts from various people who've lived here sharing their stories. And then I've written essays to kind of provide contextual information, and then also diving into things. Not many people wrote about what it's like to be in the bathtub of the building. So that's something, and I'm like, oh, okay, because the bathtubs are amazing. They're not clawfoot, but they're deep and like 1931 and fantastic. So lots of really interesting aspects of the building itself. The neighborhood, of course, very important. The West End, certainly in the LGBTQ communities. And this building represents that as well. So those voices are in this book, and it's it's a celebration of lots of different things, with coincidence also being kind of a through line. It's something that builds over the course of the book, all kinds of wild coincidences in my life and my connections with various people. And I'm really excited about this book coming out into the world. And so while, Alexander College work is kind of over for now, I'm able to then devote more time to this.
Congratulations. That's so exciting. So are you going on a book tour?
Well, a tour of the city, maybe.
Tour of the city. Yeah, I loved it. So when I was looking at your website, you hit so many cool spots around Vancouver. Yes. So is that what you normally do when you release something? Is you go do is it do you go do readings or talks, or how does that work for you? I'm
Yeah,
just
both
curious.
reading.
I love speaking with authors. Like, tell me all
Yeah.
your things.
Yeah, well, it was 2013 that I first kind of got thinking about touring, and I'd asked myself at the time, like, why do you want a full-length book so desperately? I'd had a number of rejections at that point in time, and the answer was, I want to tour. I want to do a big tour. And because I'd had a number of these smaller chapbooks published, I set up my first tour of the country in 2014. So on the strength of maybe 4 or 5 chapbooks published from Vancouver, from Victoria to maybe Hamilton, um, various micropresses. I set out on a big tour of the country, and then I had an acceptance for Jabbering with Bing Bong, which was my first book with Anvil Press, and then I toured BC with that. And yeah, with every book, I try to have some sort of a tour. 2 years ago, I did a tour of BC with Rob Taylor. His book had just come out, and we did a tour of the province together. It was so much fun. It was great to get to know him even better. I'd known him for a while through the poetry world. And yeah, and with Stanley Park Manor, well, with this book, I want to read, I'll be reading at the Rhodey House. I'll give an author talk there. We'll have a proper launch, probably at the Sylvia here in the West End. I'll do a reading in the building. I hope to have contributors.
That would be iconic, a reading in your building. That's so
Yeah.
perfect.
And maybe down the road, there'll be an opportunity to do some sort of a walking tour of the West End based on the book. That's been in the back of my mind for a bit. Every year I lead Jane's Walk. I don't know if you're familiar with Jane's
No.
Walks. Named after Jane Jacobs, the thinker, a woman who in New York, working as a secretary, wrote essays on the side of what makes a good city. And her essays on the side became the center kind of piece of her life and her thinking and her activism, stopping developers from demolishing huge neighborhoods. And those ideas spread around North America in the 1960s. And she passed some years ago, but in her honor, there are these Jane's Walks, which are volunteer-led walks through neighborhoods. They're in over 100 cities around the world. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been leading poetry-themed Jane's Walks. So I get poets to share some of their words, and we'll be doing this the first weekend of May. I'm really excited about that. Perhaps down the road, I'll do a Jane's Walk, making use of Stanley Park Manor, the book.
This is incredible. Well, I'm definitely going to have to come check out, see if there are any Jane's Walks for my Vancouver visit this summer, and then might have to make a special visit to come see you present your work in the fall. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thanks for sharing your journey. Yeah, a piece of you, Kevin. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, more literature, more poetry is all.
Just more poetry,
Yeah.
more love. Let's spread it all.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Educator Experience. We hope you're walking away feeling connected, inspired, and just a little bit more supported on your journey. Ready to go a little bit deeper? Join the Educator Experiences community and check out our courses and workshops specifically designed to support new educators as they navigate the ups, downs, and everything in between. You'll find it all at educatorexperiences.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with a fellow educator, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Together, we're building a vibrant community rooted in support and connection. See y'all next Monday.